Progesterone, it plays a heavy role in cycle regulation. It's very important for cycle health, but it also really reduces your excitatory neurotransmitters. Because as mentioned in the podcast, it produces something known as gamma aminobutyric acid. That is your calming neurotransmitter. So I recently put out a podcast on female sex hormones and how to optimize. And if I'm being honest, it's definitely not my favorite podcast. It was a little rushed and unorganized due to certain circumstances. So what I would like to do is I would like to create some videos here on hormones and do it like a video series and break this down into different parts. And starting with the physiology of hormones, kind of giving you a very generalized basic idea of steroid pathways, starting with that foundation so you can begin to learn why hormones do what they do, how they're affected by our body, our lifestyle, our environment, and whatnot, and then work our way into some ways that we can optimize these hormones. So starting with how hormones are produced is the liver is going to create cholesterol, and then cholesterol is going to be converted into pregnenolone. Now, pregnenolone, in the context of a healthy individual, should be converting to progesterone, and then that progesterone can convert to androgens, as well as a little bit of estrogen, and then those androgens will convert to testosterone, but they will also convert into another form of estrogen known as estrone, and then that testosterone can convert or aromatize into estradiol, a form of estrogen. But dependent on someone's lifestyle, genetics, environment, stress levels, pregnenolone can convert to either androgens or DHEA or testosterone or even cortisol. I will be getting into that later in the series. And so as mentioned, this is what we'd like to see in a healthy individual. And then estradiol goes out of the body. Goodbye. See you later. Okay. That's what we want to see in a healthy individual. Nothing wrong with converting to any of these other hormones. These are all very important hormones, but we would like to primarily see progesterone go this way rather than to something like cortisol, for example. Okay. So I'm going to break down a little bit more information on pregnenolone, progesterone, and estrogen. So the conversion of progesterone, as you see, is mainly controlled by your pituitary hormones. So you have your androcorticotropin hormones, you have your luteinizing hormone, and your follicular stimulating hormone. It's mainly produced by the adrenal glands, but in men, it can be produced in the gonads and in the brain as well for both male and female. And as mentioned, this is the precursor to all of your hormones. So then we work our way into progesterone. Now, let's talk in the context of both men and women. It's going to be produced by the adrenals, and then in women, women will be produced by the ovaries, and then in men is the testes. But a big portion for women of their progesterone is going to come from the corpus luteum. So if the corpus luteum, if you don't receive the sperm, then this is going to break down after ovulation, which is where you get that progesterone spike in the luteal phase of your cycle. And so, as mentioned, progesterone is just the precursor to all your hormones. Progesterone, it plays a heavy role in cycle regulation. It's very important for cycle health, but it also really reduces your excitatory neurotransmitters. Because as mentioned in the podcast, it produces something known as gamma aminobutyric acid. That is your calming neurotransmitter. But this also, a lot of people are unfamiliar with. It plays a heavy role in the immune system. Healthy levels of progesterone and estrogen really help modulate an immune system, preventing things like autoimmune or overactive pathway and chronic inflammation. So now we're making our way into estrogen. So in women, the ovaries will produce a good amount of estrogen, especially during your follicle phase. But things like insulin can really promote the ovaries to produce more estrogen. This is why when you see women with like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or endometriosis, they tend to have higher levels of estrogen because those are inflammatory conditions, and that inflammation will cause more insulin resistance, which means your body is going to secrete more insulin. So they tend to create more estrogen. This is why they have like a lot of, certain issues: water retention, fat retention, overdeveloped sexual characteristics, fibroids, all that kind of stuff. But the androgens, they can also convert, as mentioned, to estrone, which I'll get into in a second here. And then testosterone can be aromatized into estradiol. And so as mentioned, that's like the ideal path that we would like to see. But your adrenals can create estrogen as well as your fat cells. So that's another, like, obesity is on the rise. And this is where more women and men, even men, are experiencing higher levels of estrogen due to the higher body fat percentages that we are kind of seeing in today's society. So breaking down the three major forms of estrogen, we're going to look at E1 first, which is estrone. That is what your androgens are going to feed into, your androsterone specific, but I'll get into that in the other part series. This is going to be your weaker form of estrogen, and it can go back and forth from estrone to estradiol. And there are various mechanisms that can create that. I'll get into that when we go over what happens to hormones later. Now, E2, your estradiol, that is your strongest. That is your queen bee estrogen, which is mainly produced by the ovaries, but as well aromatized from testosterone. This will be more predominant in men, obviously, due to higher levels of testosterone. But once again, going back to things like PCOS and endometriosis, they can have higher levels of testosterone, more aromatization occur. So that's another way that these women can have higher levels of estrogen. And then you have your estriol, so your E3, and that is your weakest form of estrogen. You'll see this a lot in pregnant women. I'll also mention too, you'll see higher levels of estrone in postmenopausal women. But this here is more of a waste product of estradiol. So when I mentioned that E1 and E2 can convert back and forth, you cannot convert from E3 back into E2. It goes into E3 and then it has to be detoxified from there. And there are various mechanisms that can create more conversion into E3, which I'll go over in another series. So when we're talking estrogen, we are definitely talking about playing a major role in puberty, especially in women, development of sexual characteristics like breasts and wider hips and such. Very important also for building the uterine lining and just promoting healthy menstrual cycles in optimal levels. But estrogen is also super important for things like insulin sensitivity and very important for sex drive. I had a guest on yesterday for a podcast, and many competitors or even people in general think, okay, estrogen is so bad, it creates cancers and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's not estrogen per se. That's the inability to detoxify estrogen. So we kind of look at like trying to tank our estrogen, and we end up losing our sex drive. Like a lot of men will suffer from erectile dysfunction because of low estrogen. So we don't want to like completely rid of that estrogen. Super, super important. So it's also super important for growth, for like muscle building and for bone development and tissue development and bone maintenance and muscle maintenance, and very important for things like insulin sensitivity and good for the brain. And so we don't want to give estrogen a bad name. It's definitely super important for our bodies in the right levels within that hormonal symphony, so proper hormonal balance. And it's going to affect the other hormones. It's going to affect other systems in the body. So like we don't want to give estrogen a bad name, and I'm hoping that I can kind of like this video series will help people understand how important estrogen actually is, and that if you are doing the right things, that you don't have to necessarily be concerned about the dangers of estrogen. Like even when it comes to hormone replacement therapies or something, or like a lot of men who run testosterone, or whether it's at a hormone replacement dosage or like a performance enhancing dosage, they really try to, they use a lot of aromatase inhibitors so that the way the testosterone won't convert to estrogen. And it's kind of like, okay, like, yeah, we don't want to put on a bunch of water and fat and whatnot, but we also don't want to tank our estrogen. And so let's focus on making sure that we understand how important estrogen is. So yeah, hopefully, that provides it should provide quite a bit more information than what I had mentioned in the podcast. And I do again apologize, for not being the most efficient with that podcast, but I'm going to redeem myself with this video series. And as mentioned, we'll start with just the physiology and the foundation, learning that aspect, and then working our way through in how we are going to make sure that these hormones are not being negatively affected and how we could optimize them, just to feel your best and achieve, your best physique and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe button and follow me on Instagram at that.coach.curtis.